Planet Krios 4 was dying. The sun was fading, and the galaxy was leaving this frozen rock behind forever, but they left something behind. A massive, injured star wolf and her 3 shivering cubs, trapped in a cold metal cage. The alien commanders were cold. They said she was too dangerous to save. They chose to let the ice take them. As the last ship vanished, one human stayed. Mark, a simple engineer, looked into the eyes of the dying beast that he had no gun. Only a blanket and a choice. As he moved closer, the wolf bared her teeth with a terrifying growl. One button would free a monster, or save a soul. Mark took a deep breath and pressed the lock. The wind on the planet Krios 4 did not just blow, it screamed. It was a dying world. The sun above was a fading purple, losing its heat and leaving the planet to freeze in the dark. Metal buildings groaned under the weight of the ice, and the air was so thin it felt like breathing needles. High above, the sky was filled with the orange glow of massive engines. The Galactic Alliance was leaving. They were powerful, advanced, and logical. To them, Krios 4 was now just a useless rock of ice. They packed their technology and their soldiers, moving with a cold, robotic speed. They did not care about what they left behind. In the center of the main hangar, a heavy gravity cage sat alone. Inside was a creature that most of the galaxy feared, a star wolf. She was a massive predator, 10 feet tall with fur as silver as moonlight and eyes like burning embers. But today, the fire in her eyes was dim. A jagged piece of metal had torn through her side during the evacuation chaos. She was bleeding, her breath coming out in ragged, white clouds. Pressed against her shivering belly were 3 tiny cubs. They were no bigger than house cats, their eyes not yet fully open. They whimpered, sensing the freezing cold that was slowly creeping into their bones. Commander Vax, a tall alien with skin like gray stone, looked at the cage one last time. His assistant pointed at the wolf. "Sir, the star wolf is still in the gravity lock. She is injured, but the cubs are healthy. Should we load them onto the secondary transport?" Vax didn't even turn his head. He looked at his watch and adjusted his uniform. "No," he said, his voice as cold as the wind outside. "She is too dangerous to move in that state. If she wakes up during the jump, she will tear the ship apart. And the cubs are useless without a mother. Leave them. We do not waste fuel on dying animals." With those words, the commander walked away. The heavy metal doors of the last great ship hissed shut, and with a thunderous roar, it vanished into the dark sky. Silence fell over the landing pad. It was a heavy, terrifying silence. The mother wolf let out a long, low howl. It was not a howl of anger, but a howl of pure despair. She knew. She knew the heat was gone. She knew her cubs would not see the next sunrise. She licked her babies, trying to give them the last of her body heat, even as her own blood turned to ice on the metal floor. She closed her eyes, waiting for the end. But then, a soft sound broke the silence. Crunch. 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 It was the sound of boots walking on frozen snow. From behind a stack of abandoned crates, a figure emerged. It was not a tall, stone-skinned alien or a powerful warrior. It was a human. His name was Mark, a low-ranking engineer who was supposed to be on the 3rd evacuation ship. He had hidden in the shadows when he saw the commander leave the cage behind. Mark was small compared to the aliens, and even smaller compared to the wolf. He wore a dirty brown flight jacket and carried a heavy bag over his shoulder. He stood there for a long moment, watching the mother wolf. He knew the rules. Humans were told to follow the Alliance's logic. "Don't get involved," they said. "Survival is for the strong," they said, but Mark couldn't move his feet toward the escape shuttle parked nearby. He looked at the cubs. They were small, innocent, and terrified. He thought about how the Alliance looked at humans, as emotional and weak species because they cared about things that didn't bring profit. Mark felt a spark of anger in his chest. "To hell with logic," he whispered to himself. He began to walk toward the gravity cage. As he got closer, the mother wolf's ears twitched. Her eyes snapped open. Even in her weakened state, she was a killer. She bared teeth as long as combat knives and let out a growl that vibrated in Mark's very bones. Mark stopped. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. One swipe from her claws would end him. He had no gun, no armor, and no shield. He was just a man with a bag. "Easy, girl," Mark said, his voice shaking but soft. "I'm not like them. I'm not going to hurt you." The wolf didn't understand the words, but she felt the change in the air. This creature didn't smell like the cold, clinical aliens who had captured her. He smelled like sweat, old coffee, and kindness. Mark reached into his bag and pulled out a thermal blanket. He also took out a small container of synthetic meat, his own dinner for the night. He slid the meat through the bars of the cage. The mother wolf looked at it, then at him. She was starving, but she pushed the food toward her cubs first. Mark felt a lump in his throat. Even at the edge of death, she was a mother. He moved closer, his hand reaching for the glowing red button on the side of the cage. This was the gravity lock. If he pressed it, the heavy pressure holding her down would vanish. She would be free. She could kill him in a second, or she could let him help. The wind gave a powerful roar, shaking the hangar. The temperature was falling fast. If they stayed in this cage, they would all be frozen statues within the hour. Mark looked into the wolf's golden eyes. He saw the predator, yes, but he also saw a soul that didn't want to die alone in the dark. His finger hovered over the button. His mind told him to run to his shuttle and save himself. His heart told him to stay. The survival of an entire species line depended on a single choice by a weak human. Mark took a deep breath, looked at the cubs one last time, and slammed his hand down on the lock button. The red light turned green, and the heavy hiss of the cage opening filled the air. The deadliest predator in the galaxy was now free, and Mark was standing right in front of her. The heavy metal door of the cage slid open with a loud, echoing groan. The gravity field that had been pinning the star wolf to the floor vanished instantly. For a few seconds, the air felt still, even as the storm raged outside. Mark stood frozen, his hand still resting on the control panel. He didn't breathe. He didn't move. The massive silver beast slowly stood up. Even with a deep, bleeding wound in her side, she was a terrifying sight. She stood a full head taller than Mark, her muscles rippling under her thick, metallic fur. She looked down at the small human, her golden eyes narrow and sharp. She let out a low vibration from her chest, a sound so deep it made Mark's teeth ache. He was certain this was his final moment. He closed his eyes, waiting for the massive jaws to snap shut around his throat, but the attack never came. Instead, he felt a soft, wet warmth on his hand. He opened his eyes and saw the giant predator sniffing his fingers. She could smell the fear on him, but she could also smell the synthetic meat he had offered her cubs. She looked at the cubs, who were now eating the food Mark had provided, and then she looked back at Mark. In that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. She knew this tiny creature was the only reason she was standing. She lowered her head, a sign of submission that no Galactic Alliance scientist had ever seen from a star wolf. Mark let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. His legs felt like jelly, but he knew they couldn't stay here. The temperature was dropping so fast that the moisture in the air was turning into falling ice crystals. "That we have to go," Mark whispered, his voice cracking. He pointed toward his small engineering shuttle, which sat about 100 yards away across the frozen landing pad. The mother wolf tried to take a step, but she stumbled. The wound on her side was deep, and the purple alien blood was freezing into dark icicles on her fur. She let out a pained whimper, her gaze turning toward her cubs. She couldn't carry them, and she could barely walk herself. Mark realized the gravity of the situation. The mother was dying of blood loss and cold. He reached into his bag and pulled out a high-grade medical sealant, a spray used to fix leaking fuel pipes. It wasn't meant for flesh, but it was all he had. "This is going to sting, big girl," Mark said softly. He approached her side. The wolf growled instinctively, her teeth flashing, but she stayed still. Mark sprayed the cold chemical foam onto the wound. The wolf flinched, her claws digging deep furrows into the metal floor, but she didn't strike him. As the foam hardened, it stopped the bleeding and provided a layer of insulation. Next, Mark took the thermal blanket, a thin, silver sheet designed to reflect 99% of body heat, and wrapped it around the 3 cubs. He gathered them up in his arms. They were surprisingly heavy, and their tiny claws poked through his jacket, but they were warm. The mother wolf watched his every move, her eyes tracking his hands with lethal precision. When she saw him protecting her babies, her growl turned into a soft, huffing sound. They began the long walk across the landing pad. The wind was now a physical force, trying to push them back into the darkness. Mark struggled to carry the cubs while navigating the slippery ice. Beside him, the great wolf limped, using her tail to balance herself against the wind. Every few steps, she would lean her massive body against Mark, helping him stay upright against the gusts. It was a strange sight, a dying man and a dying monster, leaning on each other to survive. But as they reached the halfway point, a new sound joined the howling wind. It was a high-pitched, mechanical whine. Mark looked up and saw a red light blinking in the clouds. "Sector scan drone," Mark cursed. The Alliance had left automated drones to ensure nothing, and no one, was left alive on the planet to be captured by enemy forces. The drone descended from the clouds, its searchlight cutting through the snow like a blade. It was a sleek, black machine armed with twin plasma repeaters. It was programmed to destroy anything moving on the surface. The light swept over the landing pad and locked onto Mark and the wolf. A robotic voice boomed over the wind, "Unauthorized biological presence detected. Protocol, sterilize." The drone's weapons began to glow with a deadly blue light. Mark hugged the cubs to his chest and ducked behind a pile of frozen fuel barrels. "Stay down," he yelled to the wolf, though he knew she couldn't understand. The first blast of plasma hit the barrels, sending a shower of sparks into the air. The heat was intense, but the cold returned the second the fire died out. Mark knew his mining laser wouldn't do much against a combat drone. He looked at the wolf. She was crouched low, her eyes fixed on the flying machine. Despite her injury, her predatory instincts were taking over. She looked at Mark, then at the drone, and then back at Mark. She made a short, sharp barking sound. Mark understood. She wanted a distraction. "Okay," Mark whispered, his heart racing. "On 3. 1, 2, 3. Mark stood up and threw a heavy metal wrench at the drone. The drone's sensors immediately locked onto the movement, and it pivoted to fire at Mark. But in that split second, the Star Wolf leaped that it was a feat of impossible strength. Even injured, she launched herself 15 feet into the air. She slammed into the drone like a silver meteor. Her massive jaws clamped down on the drone's wing, and her weight dragged the machine out of the sky. They crashed into the ice in a tangle of metal and fur. The drone tried to fire, but the wolf's claws tore through its logic board, sending blue sparks flying everywhere. With a final, powerful crunch, she bit through the main power core. The drone went dark. The wolf stood over the wreckage, her breath coming in heavy gasps, blood trickling from a new cut on her paw. She looked at Mark and tossed the broken drone aside like a toy. Mark ran to her, checking for more injuries. "You're crazy," he laughed breathlessly, a mix of terror and total admiration in his voice. "Absolutely crazy." He helped her up, and they made the final push to the shuttle. He hit the ramp release, and the door lowered with a hiss of warm air. He ushered the wolf and the cubs inside. The moment the ramp closed and the seals locked, the cabin heaters kicked in. Mark collapsed onto the floor, his lungs burning from the cold air. The mother wolf lay down on the deck plates, her cubs crawling out of the blanket to snuggle into her fur. For the first time in hours, they were safe. But as Mark looked at the shuttle's computer screen, his face went pale. The drone's attack had damaged the external sensors, and a fleet of Alliance ships was heading back toward Krios 4. They weren't coming to rescue him, they were coming to finish the sterilization of the planet. The air inside the small shuttle was thick with the smell of wet fur and burnt electronics. Mark leaned against the wall, his chest heaving as he watched the mother wolf. She had taken over the small cargo area, her massive body curled around her 3 cubs. The heaters were working at full power, making the metal floor warm to the touch. The wolf's golden eyes remained open, watching Mark's every move. She wasn't growling anymore, but she wasn't relaxed either. Mark knew he had to act fast. He grabbed his professional engineering scanner, a tool usually used to find cracks in ship engines, and slowly knelt beside her. "I need to check that wound again," he said in a low, steady voice. The wolf tilted her head, watching the glowing blue light of the scanner. She seemed to understand that this human was the only thing keeping the freezing death at bay. As Mark ran the scanner over her silver fur, the device suddenly let out a sharp, high-pitched beep. It wasn't pointing at her injury. It was pointing at the back of her neck, just below the skull. Mark frowned and moved his fingers through her thick fur. His heart skipped a beat when he felt something hard and cold beneath the skin. It wasn't a bone. It was a metal cylinder, perfectly rectangular and pulsing with a faint red light. "What did they do to you?" he whispered. He adjusted the scanner to deep tissue mode. The screen filled with complex lines of alien code and military encryption. This wasn't just a tracking collar. This was a neural data drive. The Galactic Alliance hadn't just captured a wild animal, they had turned her into a living, breathing hard drive. The realization hit Mark like a physical blow. The Star Wolf was a bioweapon project. The Galactic Alliance had used her brain to store classified military secrets, thinking that no one would ever look for a top-secret file inside the head of a predator. But something had gone wrong. She was too wild, too strong to control. When the planet started to die, they decided she was a failed experiment. They didn't leave her because she was dangerous, they left her to delete the evidence. If she died in the cold, the secrets died with her. But now that she was alive and her heart was beating faster due to the warmth of the shuttle, the chip had activated. It was sending out a life sign signal to the nearest Alliance relay station. Suddenly, the shuttle's console began to scream. A red light flashed across the cockpit. "Warning, long-range scan detected," the computer's voice echoed. Mark jumped into the pilot's seat, his fingers flying across the keys. On the radar screen, a large blip appeared. It was a Zoltan scavenger ship, a heavy, brutal vessel used by the Alliance's most ruthless soldiers. They weren't coming back for a rescue. They were coming back because the data drive was still online. They were coming to kill the wolf and take the chip. "We're in trouble," Mark said, looking back at the wolf. She stood up, sensing his fear. She let out a low, vibrating huff and pushed her cubs into the corner of the cargo bay, standing in front of them like a shield of silver muscle. Mark knew his shuttle couldn't outrun a military ship. His only chance was to hide. He looked at the exterior temperature gauge, minus 120 degrees and falling. The storm outside had turned into a whiteout, a wall of ice and wind so thick that sensors struggled to see through it. "If I turn off the engines, we vanish from their radar," Mark thought out loud. "But if I turn off the engines, the heaters stop. We'll freeze in minutes." It was a deadly gamble. He looked at the wolf. She looked back, her eyes reflecting the red emergency lights of the cabin. She walked over to him and did something unexpected. She sat down right next to the pilot's chair and rested her heavy, warm head on his lap. She was offering her own body heat to him. Mark felt a wave of emotion. These superior aliens saw her as a tool, a piece of meat to hold their files. But he saw a friend. He saw a mother. He saw a soul. He reached out and stroked her soft ears. "Okay," he whispered. Let's play hide and seek. Mark hit the silent running switch. The lights in the shuttle died. The hum of the engines faded into a haunting silence. The only sound left was the whistling wind outside and the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the wolf. Within seconds, the windows began to frost over. The metal walls started to crackle as the extreme cold began to claw its way inside. Mark wrapped himself in his thickest flight suit and sat on the floor, pressed against the mother wolf's side. Her fur was like a furnace, radiating an incredible heat that defied the laws of the planet. The 3 cubs crawled over him, tucking themselves into his jacket for warmth. In the darkness, Mark watched the radar screen on his handheld tablet. He could see the Zoltan ship circling above their location. Their powerful searchlights cut through the storm, passing over the buried shuttle like the eyes of a hungry ghost. One wrong move, one loud sound, and it would all be over. The suspense was suffocating. Every time the floorboards creaked from the cold, Mark's heart stopped. Hours passed. The ice outside grew so thick that the shuttle was completely buried, creating a natural igloo that helped trap the wolf's heat inside. Mark was shivering, his breath coming out in thick clouds, but the wolf never moved. She stayed perfectly still, guarding the human who had saved her. Just as Mark thought they might actually survive the night, a loud thud shook the shuttle. It wasn't the wind. It was the sound of something heavy landing on top of them. Then, the sound of metal claws scraping against the roof. The Zoltan hadn't found them on radar, they had found them by sight. A voice, amplified by a suit speaker, boomed through the hull. "Human, we know you are in there. Hand over the beast and the data, or we will melt this ship with you inside." The scraping sound on the roof of the shuttle sounded like giant fingernails dragging across a chalkboard. Inside the dark, freezing cabin, Mark held his breath, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. The Zoltan soldiers weren't just scavengers, they were the cleanup crew for the Alliance. They were known for their cruelty and their high-tech armor that made them look like walking insects. Above him, the sound of a thermal cutter began to hiss. A small, glowing red circle appeared on the ceiling of the shuttle. They were cutting their way in. Mark looked at the mother wolf. In the dim emergency light, she looked like a statue of silver and shadow. Her ears were pinned back, and her lips were pulled away from her teeth in a silent, terrifying snarl. She knew the hunters were here. She knew the smell of the metal and the chemicals they used. These were the same beings who had put the chip in her brain and left her to die. Mark knew he couldn't win a fair fight. He was an engineer, not a soldier. He looked around the small cabin, his mind racing through every piece of equipment he had. He had a mining laser, but its battery was nearly dead. He had some liquid nitrogen for cooling engines and a bag of heavy metal bolts. Then, he looked at the shuttle's control panel. Even though the engines were off, the internal gravity plates, the floor magnets that kept things from floating in space, were still connected to the backup battery. A crazy, dangerous idea began to form in his head. "Stay back," he whispered to the wolf, pointing toward the very back of the cargo hold where the cubs were hidden. To his surprise, she didn't argue. She sensed his plan and retreated into the shadows, her eyes never leaving the hole in the ceiling. The red circle on the roof turned white-hot. With a loud clack, a circular piece of the hull fell onto the floor, sending up a cloud of steam and sparks. 2 Zoltan soldiers dropped down through the hole. They were tall, with 4 arms and glowing blue visors that could see in the dark. They held plasma rifles that crackled with energy. "Where is the beast, human?" one of them hissed, his voice sounding like 2 dry rocks rubbing together. Mark stood by the pilot's seat, his hands raised in the air, pretending to shake with fear. I don't want any trouble," Mark stammered, acting the part of the weak human the aliens expected. "The wolf is in the back. She's too weak to fight. Just take her and leave me alone." The soldiers laughed, a clicking sound that made Mark's skin crawl. They stepped forward, moving toward the center of the shuttle. This was the moment. As the 2 soldiers stepped onto the main cargo plate, Mark slammed his hand down on the emergency gravity override. Usually, the gravity was set to a comfortable 1 g. Mark flipped the switch to 10 g, the maximum power meant for heavy cargo transport. Suddenly, the two Zoltan soldiers were slammed into the floor with the force of a falling building. Their 4 arms crumbled under their own weight, and their heavy armor cracked against the deck plates. They couldn't even lift their heads, the gravity was pinning them down so hard that the metal floor began to bend. They tried to reach for their rifles, but their fingers were being crushed by the invisible weight. Mark grabbed his mining laser and aimed it at the hole in the roof, waiting for the third soldier he knew was waiting up there. A third Zoltan peered through the hole, surprised by the silence. Before he could fire, Mark triggered the liquid nitrogen canister he had rigged above the opening. A blast of super-chilled gas hit the soldier's face. His visor shattered instantly as the plastic froze and cracked, and the alien fell backward onto the roof, screaming and clutching his blinded eyes. But the victory was short-lived. The two soldiers on the floor were strong. Even at 10 g gravity, one of them managed to reach a small button on his wrist. "Reinforcements, coming." He gasped, his lungs struggling to expand under the pressure. Outside, the sound of more ships landing echoed through the hull. The Zoltan hadn't just sent a squad, they had sent a small army. Mark looked at the wolf. She saw the soldiers on the floor struggling to get up as the gravity battery began to flicker and die. She realized that the humans' trap was failing. The wolf stepped out of the shadows. She didn't look like a wounded animal anymore. She looked like the goddess of war. She walked over the high-gravity plates with ease, her alien biology much more resistant to the pressure than the Zoltan or the human. She stood over the pinned soldiers, her massive paws resting near their throats. She looked at Mark, waiting for a signal. Mark felt a cold shiver. He could tell her to kill them. He could let her take her revenge. But then he heard the cubs whimper in the back. "No," Mark said firmly. "We don't have time for revenge. We have to move." He knew that the Zoltan would simply blow the shuttle up from the outside if they didn't leave now. He grabbed his bag and the thermal blanket with the cubs. He looked at the wolf and then at the open ramp. "We're taking their ship," he said, pointing to the larger Zoltan vessel parked just 50 yards away. It was a suicide mission. A lone human and an injured wolf charging into a squad of elite soldiers. But as the wolf let out a roar that shook the very walls of the shuttle, Mark felt something he had never felt before. He wasn't just an engineer anymore. He was part of a pack. And a human pack never leaves anyone behind. The cold air of Krios hit Mark like a wall of solid ice the moment he lowered the shuttle's ramp. He had the 3 cubs tucked safely into his heavy engineering jacket, their small hearts beating fast against his chest. Beside him, the Star Wolf stood tall, her silver fur bristling in the wind. She looked different now. The warmth of the shuttle and the medical foam had given her a second wind. Her eyes weren't just glowing, they were vibrating with a strange, blue energy. The Zoltan soldiers outside were waiting, their plasma rifles aimed at the ramp. "Surrender the asset, human," their leader shouted over the roar of the storm. Mark didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He looked at the mother wolf and whispered one word, "Go." What happened next was not the movement of an animal, it was the movement of a ghost. The Star Wolf didn't just run, she blurred. As she leaped from the ramp, her silver fur began to pulse with a blinding blue light. This was the bioweapon power the Alliance had been trying to harness. She emitted a powerful electromagnetic pulse, EMP, from her own body. Suddenly, the Zoltan soldiers' high-tech visors went black. Their plasma rifles hummed and died in their hands. The weak human and his dying pet had just turned the most advanced soldiers in the galaxy into blind men holding heavy sticks. The wolf tore through the line of soldiers like a whirlwind, using her weight to knock them into the snow before they could even draw their backup blades. Mark didn't waste a second. He ran toward the Zoltan scavenger ship, a massive vessel called the Shadowclaw. It was parked 50 yards away, its engines still warm and glowing. He knew that more soldiers would be coming out of the ship at any moment. As he ran, he pulled out a handful of heavy metal bolts from his pocket. He hadn't just brought them for weight, he had wired them to a small battery. He threw them toward the ship's landing gear. The bolts stuck to the metal and began to vibrate, creating a high-frequency sound that confused the ship's automated defense turrets. The turrets spun wildly, unable to lock onto Mark or the wolf. It was a simple human trick, but against billions of credits worth of alien tech, it worked perfectly. They reached the ship's boarding ramp just as the heavy doors began to close. The Zoltan captain had realized the danger and was trying to lock them out. "Hold it!" Mark yelled, sliding his heavy mining laser into the gap of the closing door. The powerful hydraulics hissed and groaned, trying to crush the tool, but the mining laser was built to withstand the pressure of deep space rocks. It held the door open by just a few inches. The mother wolf saw the gap. She shoved her massive snout into the opening and roared. The sound was so powerful that it cracked the reinforced glass of the nearby control panel. With a burst of sheer strength, she pushed her shoulders into the gap and forced the heavy metal doors back. They were inside. The interior of the Shadowclaw was a maze of dark hallways and purple lights. It smelled like ozone and old metal. Mark and the wolf moved through the corridors like a professional team. Every time a soldier appeared around a corner, the wolf would use her speed to disarm them, and Mark would use his knowledge of ship layouts to find the fastest way to the bridge. The wolf seemed to know exactly where the data chip in her neck was being pulled. She led Mark deeper into the ship, toward the central computer core. She wasn't just trying to escape anymore, she wanted to take back what they had stolen from her. She wanted her mind back. They finally reached the heavy blast doors of the bridge. Behind these doors was the captain and the controls to the ship. But there was a problem. The captain had activated a laser grid in the hallway. Thousands of red beams of light crossed the path. If anything touched them, the ship's security system would vaporize it instantly. Mark stopped, his heart sinking. "I can't hack this," he whispered. "It's a hardwired circuit." He looked at the wolf, feeling like they had finally reached a dead end. But the wolf didn't stop. She walked right up to the laser grid. Her fur began to glow even brighter, the blue light becoming so intense that Mark had to shield his eyes. The wolf let out a low, melodic hum. Suddenly, the air around her began to warp. The laser beams didn't cut her, they bent around her. Her bioenergy was creating a localized gravitational field, a natural version of the technology the Alliance spent trillions trying to build. She walked through the deadly grid as if it were nothing but a light rain. Once she was on the other side, she smashed the control panel with one heavy paw, deactivating the lasers for Mark. Mark stood there in shock. "You're not just a weapon," he breathed. "You're a miracle." They stood before the final door. Mark gripped his mining laser, and the wolf bared her glowing teeth. On the other side was the man who had ordered them to die. The real fight was about to begin. The final blast doors of the bridge hissed open, revealing a room filled with glowing screens and the hum of powerful engines. At the center stood Captain Krell, the Zoltan leader. He was taller than the other soldiers, his skin a dark, bruised purple, and his eyes glowing with a cold, hateful light. He didn't look afraid. In his hand, he held a small, silver remote control. "You have been a very annoying monkey, human," Krell said, his voice echoing through the silent bridge. He looked at the Star Wolf, who was growling so loudly the floor vibrated. "And you, beast, did you think you were free? You are a product. A tool. And I have the off switch." Before Mark could react, Krell pressed a button on the remote. The mother wolf suddenly let out a scream of pure agony. The metal chip in her neck began to glow a bright, angry red. She collapsed to the floor, her massive body shaking as the neural drive sent thousands of volts of electricity directly into her brain. The cubs inside Mark's jacket began to cry, sensing their mother's pain. "Stop it!" Mark yelled, aiming his mining laser at the captain. Krell only laughed. "If you kill me, the chip will explode. She dies, the cubs die, and the data is lost. Drop your tool, human. Logic dictates you have already lost. Mark looked at the wolf. She was looking at him, even through her pain. Her golden eyes were pleading, not for her own life, but for her baby's. Mark's mind raced. He wasn't a soldier, but he was the best engineer in his sector. He realized the remote control wasn't using a magic signal, it was using the ship's own internal Wi-Fi to talk to the chip. He didn't need to kill the captain, he needed to break the ship. Mark didn't drop his laser. Instead, he aimed it at the ceiling, at the main signal repeater that managed all the ship's wireless communications. You're right, Krell, Mark said, his voice turning cold and steady. Humans are emotional. But our emotions make us very, very creative. Mark fired the laser. The beam punched through the ceiling, melting the signal repeater into a pile of smoking plastic. The red light on the wolf's neck blinked once and went dark. The pain vanished instantly. The wolf stood up, her silver fur standing on end, her eyes locked onto the captain. Krell's face went pale. He pressed the button on his remote again and again, but nothing happened. The off switch was broken. The wolf didn't wait for an order. She lunged forward with the speed of a lightning bolt. She didn't kill Krell, she was smarter than that. She pinned him against the command chair, her massive jaws just inches from his throat. The captain frozen in terror, smelling the death on her breath. Mark walked up to the main communication console. He didn't just want to escape, he wanted the whole galaxy to know what had happened here today. He plugged his engineering tablet into the ship's transmitter and hit the emergency galaxy-wide broadcast button. Attention all sectors, Mark said, his face appearing on millions of screens across the Galactic Alliance. My name is Mark, a human engineer. You are looking at the Shadowclaw, a Zoltan ship you sent to kill a mother and her children. You call us a weak species because we care. You call this beautiful creature a monster because you couldn't control her. But today, the weak and the monster took your ship. From this day on, humanity is no longer part of your alliance. We are starting our own pack. And if you ever come for us, remember what happened to your invincible soldiers on Krios. Mark ended the broadcast and looked at the cowering captain. Get in the escape pods, Mark ordered. All of you. Now. The Zoltan crew didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled for the pods and launched themselves into the cold dark of space. Mark was now in control of a high-tech military ship. He walked over to the mother wolf and gently placed her cubs on the floor. She licked them softly, then walked over to Mark and nudged his hand with her nose. They weren't just a man and an animal anymore. They were the founders of something new. A year later, on a hidden, beautiful green planet far from the Alliance's reach, a new colony was growing. It wasn't just a colony of humans. Giant silver wolves walked through the streets, acting as guardians and friends. Children played in the grass, riding on the backs of the once feared predators. Mark stood on a balcony, watching the sunset with the mother wolf by his side. Her wound had healed into a proud scar. The galaxy used to be a cold, logical place, but a weak human and a deadly wolf had changed everything. They had proven that in the vastness of space, the greatest power isn't a laser or a bomb, it is the bond of a pack that refuses to break.